Okay, dear colleagues, so thank you very much for coming back from the lunch safely. We have our first afternoon session with two very interesting speakers. And we start with a keynote presentation of, I would not be afraid to say this, one of the most influential economic thinkers in the field of finance today. He is a research professor of economics at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the research associate at the Levi Economics Institute of Bard College. A former Wall Street analyst and consultant, as well as president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, and the founding member of International Scholars Conference, or Ancient Near Eastern Economies. He has been an advisor to governments of many countries, and in particular to US governments and influential decision makers. And in 1990, he established the world's first Third World Sovereign Debt Fund, which became the second best performing international fund in 1991. Currently, he is known as widely publishing critique of many things in the current economic and financial system. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to present to you Professor Michael Hudson.
I've been trying to think how to make a bridge between what I'm writing about and what you're discussing here. I think the common denominator is that we all see that the current financial system is broken and it's bringing austerity, and that what people expected from finance capitalism and increasing from industrial capitalism, all of the increasing productivity that should have given us all a life of leisure now, instead is bringing about austerity and the crisis that you see in the euro today. So what you're really seeing is a war of the financial system against society. You've seen the largest money creation in European and American history in the last 4 years. None of this money has been to circulate goods and services. None has been paid as income to workers or savings or to what we in Occupy Wall Street call the 99%. It's been given to the banks in order to compensate them for the loans that have gone bad. So all of the talks here that I've seen this morning have focused upon the production and consumption economy and people paying for goods and services, but this isn't what most money is paid for. Every year, every day, an entire year's gross domestic product passes through the New York Clearinghouse and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. 99.9% of money is used to pay bank loans, to pay for stocks, bonds, and mortgages, and speculative derivatives, not for the goods and services you're talking about. And so while this morning, for instance, Trond Andersen, my friend who we've discussed many years, described the usual monetary economy, which economists call MV equals PT, or money times the velocity of circulation equals the price level in transactions. This is only a small portion of what the financial system does. Instead of the money that you're talking about, the banking system creates credit in much larger multiples than money. Instead of the velocity of circulation, which is simply a tautological mathematical balancing item, you have debt leveraging. Money is debt. And while you are talking about price stability, and what you mean are for goods and services, food, clothing, and transport, this isn't really what's been rising. Prices have been remarkably stable, and in fact are falling in many countries now for the last 30 years. What has gone up is the largest inflation we've seen in history. But the inflation has been in housing prices, stock, and above all, bond prices. You've had a huge bond rally from the time when interest rates were 20% in 1980 down to 0.1% today. So bonds have far outperformed stocks or anything else. But you're not talking about bonds and stocks. That's not your concern. Quite properly, you're looking for how you can use a community system or some other credit to withdraw from this poisonous, toxic financial system. And I can understand the motivation in wanting to withdraw from the system. In the 19th century, many European idealists, followers of Saint-Simon, followers of other French idealists, German Anabaptists earlier, they all moved to America, moved to the West, and after World War I, most of the American socialists and reformers also gave up, moved out west, and just sort of disappeared, rather than trying to transform the system that has become so poisonous today. So the problem is, how can you create a kind of 0.001% bubble when you have the 99.99% system cannibalizing everything? You have the banking system turning itself into a hereditary oligarchy, very much like the landlord class of medieval Europe after the Nordic invasions, who seized the land, took the rent, then the bankers lent money to rulers to pay for armies to conquer yet more land, to privatize more rent away from the community. And not only taking the land, but the subsoil mineral rights and natural monopolies. And by about 1600, governments in England, Holland, France got so heavily debt burdened that they decided to pay the debts by creating artificial trading monopolies. The South Sea, the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Bank of England in 1694, the South Sea Company in the 1710s, and the Mississippi Company in France. And all of these were basically a forfeiture, a voluntary permitting of the creditors to foreclose on what originally was public property. In Austria and the Habsburg Empire, you had the Habsburgs pledge the mines in Spain, other mines again and again and again. So I think the starting point to frame the whole discussion that we're all having here today is what is the problem that you're trying to cure? Because the diagnosis implies the solution. My article, what I'm going to say today, is going to take off from what Margaret Kennedy said earlier. Our presentations are very similar in structure, but what I want to focus on is what monetary policy won't cure. Even if I realize that all of you have different ideas about local currency, domestic currency, and others, but there are certain problems that I don't think any will cure. For one thing, they won't cure the current insolvency. The fact that the debt overhead is so large that it can't possibly be paid. You have the political crisis in Europe today is Angela Merkel and the German bankers coming out and saying, wait a minute, why should we create a government monetary issue to pay for the Spanish banks that have all made fraudulent loans by crooked bankers lending to crooked real estate developers, and all the cronies have already paid themselves out all of their bonuses and taxes. Same thing in Ireland. Ireland was crazy to let the crooked banks that have worked with crooked real estate developers and made huge loans, and then the European Central Bank said the basic principle governing Europe from henceforth is that no creditor should lose a penny, that they are willing to plunge Europe into depression and lower wages by 30% and force immigration just so that no banker in Ireland can lose a penny, no banker in Spain can use a penny, that the corrupt people who have doubled the 1% that have doubled its share of wealth in America to 72% now of all of the wealth of 1%. They are to keep everything they have, and as interest grows exponentially, as you saw in Margaret Kennedy's graph, this means that more and more interest is sucked out of the economy to pay the creditors, and what you have is exactly the same dynamic that you had in medieval times of victorious countries extorting tribute from the population and taking over the property and foreclosing on the land, mines, and natural monopolies. So basically, you have finance today playing the role that military conquest did in times past. The objective of banks in making a loan is exactly the same as warlords who conquered England, France, and the rest of Europe. They want the land, they want tribute, but they call it interest extraction. They want the monopolies, they want all of the means of production, but most of all, they want the rest of the population to be so poor that it's dependent upon them. Poverty is a solution to the oligarchy. It also, by the way, will solve many of your concerns with population growth. You have in debt-racked countries from Russia to Latvia and now to Greece, declining lifespans, rising suicide rates, falling family formation, falling birth rates, falling marriage rates. In America, the student loans are so large, and these are loans that the government guarantees that cannot be wiped out in bankruptcy. They're so large that students are now having to live at home with their parents. They can't afford to get married. They can't afford to buy a house. And so you have debt curing your population problem. So a local currency will not cure this insolvency problem. It won't cure the debt overhead, and it won't cure the bad tax policy. 30 years ago, and indeed for hundreds of years, the governments of all countries raised the money that the government spends by taxing real estate, mines, by taxing economic rent. The basis of classical British and French political economy, from the physiocrats in France to Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill and the Progressive era reformers, was all to say, how do we free society from the warping that feudal medieval conquest created? How do we free society from landlords just obtaining rent without work, from bankers obtaining interest without any cost of production? And the focus of classical economics was to distinguish between price and value. Price was the excess over the cost of production that rentiers took, that landlords, monopolists, and bankers took without having to work at all, is a property claim. This is really the problem that has to be solved. One of the central points that I want to make is that financial reform and tax reform have to go together. For one thing, the basis of money is its use, its acceptability in paying taxes. But in order to have this acceptability, what George Friedrich Knapp called the state theory of money, in order to give money value in paying taxes, you have to levy taxes. The last 30 years have seen an enormous tax shift off property, off finance, onto labor. Not only by cutting the progressive income tax, but by dropping the taxes on property, dropping the land tax, and replacing it with value-added taxes and taxes on transactions. So you have the economy turned upside down to what was expected in the 19th century. You have exactly the opposite, a dysfunctional system in which the debts really can't be paid. Now, I could have called my talk, debts that can't be paid won't be. Because whatever you suggest here, whatever we do, one way or another, the debts are already too large to be paid. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations that no government ever had repaid its debt, although some had pretended to do so. And in his day, most of the debts were government debts. Today they're private debts, and you have a situation where 1/4 of American real estate is in negative equity. The mortgage is larger than the value of the property. So the problem is that you have the commercial banks having moved into a system in which they are extracting money from the economy. They're not productive. The banking sector, and in fact what Americans call the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, is not really part of the economy. We can call it economy number 2. The real economy is what you've been speaking about this morning, economy number 1, production and consumption. But the wealth economy and debt economy, economy number 2, has grown much larger, it's extractive, it's very much like a parasite wrapping around or taking over an economy, taking out the nourishment, in this case, extracting the revenue. But the most important thing about parasites isn't simply that they drain the revenue. In biological nature, parasites take over the brain of the host to make the host protected, to make the host imagine that the parasite is part of its own body and even its baby to feed. And that's what you have seen today with the European Union saying we have to save the banks, with the Obama administration saying we have to pay the banks, the economy won't function without the banks, whereas actually the economy would function quite well without the banks. It would function with only the payments that you've been talking about for production and consumption. But unfortunately, this real economy number 1 has been so parasitized that you have debt deflation. Margaret Kennedy showed earlier today the charts of how much housing and goods and services interest absorbs. I can give you an example from the United States. If you take the average worker's budget in the United States, 40% of income goes for housing, mainly for mortgage debt. The ratio is only 20% in Germany, by the way. 15% of the workers' salaries are withheld for Social Security and Medicare, essentially way in advance of the cost of Social Security and Medicare. It's siphoned off as wage withholding in order to lend to the government so that it can cut taxes on the upper classes and give them enough money to buy the politicians. In America, in order to be a committee head of the Senate or the House of Representatives, the politician has to pay the Democratic Party $1 million, and the price goes up. They get the $1 million from their campaign contributors, and the largest campaign contributor sector in America is Wall Street, the banking and financial sector. So literally, politics is now put up for auction. Most of the political campaign money is spent on television, with the idea being that whoever can buy the most television time will buy the minds of the people to convince them that it's in their interest to lower their wages for 30%. So the Obama administration and the Social Democrats in Germany and Greece say, our program is to lower wages by 30%, to stop social spending, to stop education, to make you go into debt to buy an education. And they're winning at the polls because they're told this is the most efficient system. This is the degree to which the financial sector has parasitized the economy and poisoned the brains of the entire economics profession. What the bankers realize is what the Chicago School said in Shelley. The Chicago School applied Margaret Thatcher's axiom, there is no alternative. They said to make sure that Margaret Thatcher was right and there is no alternative, the first thing that the Chicago Free Market said, in order to have a free market financial style, we have to close down every economics department in the country, except for the Catholic University in Valparaiso. We have to close down every social science department. We have to assassinate every union leader and kill every professor and start an international assassination movement, Operation Condor, including the assassination of Americans. This is the only way to have a free market. If you're not willing to kill everyone who disagrees with you, you cannot have a free market financial style. And this is the Chicago School definition of equilibrium in the political sense. I went to the Chicago, University of Chicago and the lab school. A few years ago, some of us wanted to remember what we were doing as teenagers. So we wrote to the FBI for the secret police for the files on us. We found that the teachers reported every week on our political beliefs. These were in the 1950s, our views. My father was a political prisoner in America for reading illegal books in the 1940s. The definition of, you could go to jail under the Smith Act if you had books by Marx or the communists on your shelf. The main supporters of this were, of course, the Communist Party itself, who wanted to make sure that there were no non-Stalinist socialist parties in America. So this is a sort of untold story. So at any rate, to get back to the effects of all of what I'm saying, we're in a period now of debt deflation. The attempt to pay the debts that can't be paid is going to be austerity that you're seeing in Greece, Iceland, Ireland, and now in America. You're going to have a shrinking economy. And the question is, how is there a way of escaping from this? There are only two ways of not paying debts. One way is to let the creditors foreclose on the collateral that's pledged. The banks will take over all the real estate. They will take over, essentially, the lifetime earnings of the population that has gone into debt. So the objective of the Wall Street and European banking system is that all of the economic surplus should be paid as interest. When I worked for the Chase Manhattan Bank in 1964 to 1967, my job was to calculate how much Latin American countries could afford to borrow. What I did was I calculated all of the economic surplus, their export surplus, their taxability, and the idea was to lend them enough money to absorb the entire economic surplus in the form of interest. This is called capitalizing the economy. This is taught in business schools. This is taught as the way to make money, or as Alan Greenspan called it, wealth creation. All of this wealth creation of bidding up property prices that people thought was making them rich was all financed on debt. So while mortgages went up, so did the debt. And as the austerity broke the whole system, the debts remained in place. The value of the house fell, and many people, families from America to Europe, are now being called upon to make up the losses of the value of their collateral, the debts that they've run up that no longer are covered by the collateral. This is the result of collateral-based banking. And one thing that if you are going to discuss monetary reform, I would like you to read what was written before World War I, when there was a great argument between the British and the Germans over what kind of banking the world would have. The British had a hit-and-run system of lending against collateral to make sure they could get paid. The Germans had an industrial banking system. It was called the Mitteleuropa system. And the idea was that banks would lend industry the money to create new capital. Instead of being based on what they could grab, the German and Austrian and Central European banks lent against what could be created. In America, this is not legal anymore. This is a bank can only lend against a secured form of income. The idea was that the stock market would provide equity capital instead of debt capital, but the stock market is now not doing that. It's become a vehicle for corporate raiders to borrow money to buy companies and load them down with debt. What is amazing is that all of this was known 4,000 years ago. The chart that Martin Kennedy showed about exponential growth of interest and an S-curve. These same charts in mathematics were taught to scribes in Babylonia in 2000 BC. We have the textbooks. They've all been published that they taught. Now, the amazing thing is that the mathematical models put forth 4,000 years ago were more sophisticated than the models that are produced in universities today. And the reason is that they knew that the debts tended to grow in excess of what could be paid, and their solution was the rulers would declare a clean slate. They'd cancel the debts. When any new ruler came to the throne, from Sumer, Babylonia, down to Judaic times, they would cancel the debt, start with a clean slate, cancel the debts. They would also cancel the debts when there was a drought or a flood or an interruption of the means of the chains of payments. Now, they were able to do this because most debts were owed to the public sector. Throughout the Bronze Age, there was an understanding that finance was basically a public utility and was run for the public sector. And as one of the Egyptian pharaohs was reported to say, if you let the creditors foreclose, then they'll foreclose on debtors who will lose their land. If they lose the land, they lose their citizenship rights. If they lose the citizenship rights, they cannot be drafted into the army, and the country will lose to other societies that do cancel the debts. And in fact, the Greek military man in the 2nd century BC, by Tacitus, said for a general, if you want to conquer a city, announce that you're going to cancel the debts of the population, they'll all come over to your side. And if you're defending a city, make the same promise. This is what Zedekiah did in Israel, went back on his word. It's what Coriolanus did in Rome, and went back on his word and refused to free the slaves and the debt-bound persons afterwards. But basically, you had the clean slates occur again and again in antiquity. The most recent example of one is the German monetary reform of 1948, when they canceled the debts of everyone except wage debts owed by employers, and everybody was left with a basic guaranteed bank deposit. It's easy to cancel the debts when they were all owed to Nazis. Today, the creditors are in a similar antagonistic situation to society, and there really isn't any solution except to cancel the debts. Now, in the statement that was being circulated for all you to sign, you were talking about wanting to make money stable. But money is debt. What do you want to do about debt? You don't want to make the debts stable. You don't want to keep the debts in place. You want to wipe them out. I don't think that Silvio Gesell's idea of the stamp plan, the reduction of currency, could be applied to the debt overhead of mortgages, bonds, and stocks, or real estate. And the only way to keep down the prices of these is really to tax away the economic rent surplus. So the conclusion is that you need not only to deal with the debt overhead, but to use tax policy and to treat the credit system as a public utility, not as a privatized means of conquest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hudson. We will have an opportunity to continue the discussion during the panel that will conclude today's program. So our second speaker in this section is Dr. Christian Arnsperger, who is a German economist, Doctor of Economic Sciences at the Catholic University of Leuven and Master of Research at FNRS. The main spheres of his research are the epistemology of economics, the anthropological implications of economic growth, and the transition from capitalism to post-capitalism. Notably, Dr. Arnsperger is a colleague and co-author of Bernard Lietaer, whom we hope to see on our next conference as well. So, Dr. Arnsperger, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here for these 2.5 days in the company of so many highly regarded practitioners and thinkers in the area of currency reform. Bernard Lietaer and I indeed have quite recently co-authored and published with Sally Gerner and Stefan Brunhuber a report of the Club of Rome's European chapter, which was delivered to the NGO Finance Watch based in the European Parliament. And the title of the report is Money and Sustainability, the Missing Link. Implicit in this title is the idea that we surely all share here, more or less, I suppose, that we can't understand the way out of our multi-pronged predicament of unsustainability if we don't question very deeply the way our economies produce, circulate, and destroy money. In the short time I have available, I certainly won't be able to offer an exhaustive overview. In addition, this is going to be, as I understand, done in 30 minutes tomorrow. So we don't, and the report is already out, so the overview is not needed anyway. Nor would I be competent to do so at this stage. As an economist who's interested in ecological and monetary issues, I don't purport to replace the long-time experts who are gathered here, but I would like to provide a general outline, a big picture, if you will, of some of the new mechanisms that could and should be created. Just two comments. First of all, I have outside put down a background paper for which this is sort of a digest, if you like, on Swiss monetary reform. I tried to develop a much more detailed account of how a country like Switzerland, which isn't tied down to the EU, which is federalist, which has some specific aspect which is also very rich, could carry out monetary reform. That paper is available on the desk outside. Also, I have here, for those of you who after my talk will still be interested in what I said, an error-free version of my talk. The one in the folder, unfortunately, contains a few fatal errors. I'm not going to tell you which, but you can have an error-free one if you want. Now, frontline energy peak experts like Richard Heinberg have finally begun to recognize, Heinberg's last book, The End of Growth, to recognize what money reform thinkers and activists have been telling us for a very long time, namely that a built-in flaw in our money system is creating constant systemic pressures towards energy overconsumption. That built-in flaw we've already talked about, Margaret has set it out in detail, is the interest-based circulation of bank debt money that is of about between 50 and 90% of the whole money in circulation in our daily lives. Because everyone needs to repay the yearly interest on their loans, and because due to the fact that private banks are for-profit firms, new loans keep being reissued as long as confidence is sufficiently high, we know that there's a general scramble for currency, since everyone tries to extract a corresponding surplus from their transaction, and since many fail to do so, and need to go deeper into debt in order to keep ahead of their interest payments, the whole economy is really geared systemically and not just incidentally towards exponential growth. That much is clear, and I think that should be a clear background, piece of background knowledge for all of us. And this has little, if anything, to do with people's greed or with the alleged nature of humans. It has to do, in my opinion, with a choice of institutional design in which the production of the public good, represented by the availability of payment power in the economy, has been entrusted to, and that's a political choice, to for-profit private agents. Now, at the microeconomic level, this problem isn't so visible, and interest many times seems legitimate, justified, you know, but however, at the macroeconomic level, using debt money, and Michael has just driven this home again quite graphically, using debt money as the main mechanism for the issuance of currency turns out to be highly problematic, to say the least. Now, in essence, the problem of unsustainability stems from the existence of wrong incentives within the existing money system. Bank debt money circulation implies, in the words of the ecological economist Herman Daly, a process of increasingly uneconomic growth. Energy efficiency is certainly desirable along a transition path, but the main issue is how we are going to finance the corresponding investments, and even more importantly, whether the way we finance them is going to stand in our way once we move beyond energy efficiency towards the relocalization of economic activities, the generalized reduction in material throughput and output. That is, once we need to move from quantitative growth to qualitative development, to borrow another of Daly's expressions. What sorts of currencies do we need in our wealthy, developed economies so that we can finance and maintain a more or less stationary economic system? That to me is one of the main crucial questions of the time, at least for our rich, wealthy economies. Okay? Our businesses want to grow because they want to be able to pay out dividends to their shareholders so that they can in the future obtain fresh capital by issuing new shares, and because they want to be able to pay back, they have to be able to pay back principal plus interest to their banks so that they can in the future obtain new loans. Now, why might they constantly need fresh capital and new loans? Well, because first, they need to compete with each other for market shares. And this forces them to invest constantly so that they can generate the needed labor productivity hikes. Okay. Second, they have to face ever-increasing energy costs, which endangers their cash flows, and which forces them to invest constantly so they can generate the needed energy efficiency hikes. Now, the resulting macroeconomic growth imperative, of course, means that since the mere creation of nominal growth through inflation is self-defeating, it means that material output needs to increase even when per unit throughput falls. Which means, energy efficiency isn't all that matters, to say the least. And this leads to the well-known rebound effect, in which energy consumption continues to increase despite substantial efficiency gains. So we seem to be locked into a systemic logic in which the generalized need to get one's hands on a currency, which is made artificially scarce, selectively scarce by for-profit bank credit, that generalized need generates a constant race for more, making, I think, the dream of absolute energy production decoupling a mere fantasy. We don't just need to consume less energy per unit produced, we need to produce fewer units. You may ask, fewer units of what? Well, the answer is fewer units of that abstract general commodity that gets produced every year in our economies, and whose quantity we never observe firsthand. We deduce it by deflating the total value added in the economy, the nominal GDP, for which we have data, by the famous consumer price index to obtain the real GDP, which is a mere statistical construction, as you all know, representing an abstract general commodity. Sorry, Michael, I'm going to be going back to the quantity equation. Well, okay. In fact, money GDP, to me, is nothing more, it's not really a measure of performance or something to be valued in itself. It's just the accounting magnitude that measures how many velocity-adjusted currency units, written M times V in technical economic language, were used to effect all the monetary transactions, written P times Q, which economic agents, consumers, businesses, and government deemed necessary or desirable that year. Monetary transactions, not all that's useful or all that's good. Okay? So it has nothing to do with, of course, with well-being, or at least nothing directly. Real GDP, therefore, is nothing more than an artificially constructed aggregate measure of all the units of goods and services which were purchased by the money that was in circulation at the given general price level, and this can be simply written as you are seeing. Okay, just change the equation around. If we call E the amount of energy consumed capital E, and lowercase e, the energy efficiency of the economy, we get simply, another identity here, which is simply that energy, this equation which says that the energy consumed is a function of all these parameters, including energy efficiency, of course. Now, energy consumption as a result can be reduced. This is tautological, it's very simple. Through higher efficiency, lower per unit throughput through a higher lowercase e, or through lower output. There's not much more that can be done. If there's inflation and no additional money, which could be the case if energy prices soar, then energy consumption will drop because real output necessarily decreases unless people use each existing monetary unit more often, unless the velocity increases. Just tautological reason here. Now, I think this simple equation allows us to somewhat visualize what the monetary reform proposal of plain money, in German Vollgeld, which was, for instance, developed by James Robertson and Joseph Huber in a report of the New Economics Foundation in 2000. What that monetary reform proposal could induce in combination with the generalization of sustainability-oriented banking. These are the two first components of the title of my presentation. Okay? Suppose that, first of all, there's a public-minded central bank, or a sort of currency board, okay, which becomes the sole issuer of the national currency, so that banks become mere money brokers who can no longer create new sight deposits through credit, which is the main aspect of the plain money reform. Okay. Secondly, suppose that banks can only, that's also a crucial aspect, banks can only lend money that they first borrowed off, I'll simplify, they can also borrow from the central bank. So just suppose, to simplify it, they have to borrow it off the sight deposits of their clients and channel it into savings deposits. Okay? And lastly, suppose that clients put their money into savings accounts and want that money, if they do put it into savings account, which they effectively hand over to their bank for lending purposes, to be invested in energy efficiency projects. Okay? Then we could easily imagine that there's no public creation of additional money. Let's simplify it in the extreme. Okay? This is an idealized little thought experiment. Okay? No additional creation of money. Okay? There is an amount delta C of credit corresponding to sustainability-oriented credit creation by banks. Okay? And it's absolutely crucial to note that in a very simple way, in this model, in the Huber-Robertson model, you can have delta C positive, you can have credit creation that goes along precisely with zero money creation by the state. Okay? Banks can generate credit only by shifting sight deposits into time deposits. That is, they borrow the money from their clients and they create a scriptural shift from one type of account to another without increasing the money supply. Okay? It can be then that as a result, E is going to increase, the energy efficiency is going to increase by an amount corresponding to the new investments that were financed. Now, given that, which means that the banks were sort of successful in doing a competent job in channeling savings into good projects, if moreover, the velocity is constant, which we could assume, which is often assumed in monetary economics, while the price level increases strongly due, among other things which are crucial here, higher oil and gas prices, for instance, then just simply tautologically, we will get a negative growth rate for energy consumption. Okay, in other words, credit creation for sustainability purposes can lead not just to higher energy efficiency, but to a net decrease in total energy consumption in the economy under the assumption, which is sort of extreme for now, okay, that money creation, delta M, okay, does not feed additional consumption spending. Now, after having talked a bit with Josh over the past 2 days, I gather that this may be a sort of timid foray into the idea of selective credit allocation across sectors, okay, but we should talk about that. Again, you may want to come in later about this, okay? Now, so, under the assumption that money creation does not feed additional consumption spending, which is likely to be the case, or could be the case in our example here, where money creation is public, but would not be likely if money were still issued through credit transformed into sight deposits, because then banks are not that discriminating. Now, would the distribution of sustainability-oriented credit be carried out by social and sustainable banks or by mainstream banks? Well, I think this model here, quote unquote, can provide good arguments in favor of the former, of the sustainable and social banks. If we view the ratio, the growth rate of energy efficiency over the growth rate of sustainability-oriented credit, call it pi, okay, as a measure of the project selection skill of banks, okay, in the sense that how much energy efficiency is generated through this increase in credits, then there's a good presumption that arguably social and sustainable banks such as Banca Etica, GLS Bank, Alternative Bank Switzerland, La Nef, and so on, these alternative banks that have been developing for decades now, that devote their entire activity to sustainability-oriented financing, that they have knowledge and experience which would make their pi ratio significantly higher than that of classical mainstream banks that do green banking only as a side activity. At least some people who've studied the sector, people like Sven Rehmer and Olaf Weber, seem to claim that there's a favorable argument, although they don't use that pi ratio idea, but same thing, right? There's a favorable argument in favor of these specific, possibly smaller banks, very specialized, sustainability-oriented banks doing a much better job in hunting out and financing these particularly E-enhancing projects. Okay, up for discussion, anyway. Therefore, a combination of public money creation, which allows to rein in the circulation of money for standard productivist and consumerist spending by households and businesses. And I would add, in reaction to Michael, also rein in the circulation of money for speculative reasons. So public money creation and social and sustainable banking, which allows to focus private money creation through bank credit on sustainability enhancing investments. The combination of these two things can significantly help in reducing macroeconomic energy consumption. Of course, there's an additional benefit to the plain money idea, which is that it would largely eliminate the boom and bust roller coaster of the traditional money system. And this would certainly also, I think, by itself contribute to sustainability, because booms can generate huge overexploitation of resources, while busts reduce resource pressures in the short run, but they create a sort of atmosphere of deprivation, of economic and social depression, that is not conducive, I think, to long-lasting reductions in energy consumption. You can see this going on right now with the crisis here. As soon as a bust is overcome, the mentalities are in place to start the trend towards overconsumption again. So a more structurally stable banking system would not eliminate the debt problem, the debt overhang problem, but would certainly be conducive in itself, I think, to more environmental sustainability. Now, please note an important point. I haven't assumed that households and businesses devote no spending at all to non-sustainability oriented activities in consumption, production, okay? After all, even under the plain money model, there is a publicly created money stock, which I assume doesn't vary here, but it's there. Right? available in the economy in the form of cash and checking accounts, and how people are going to use that money can be prescribed, right? They might still buy cheap Chinese plastic toys, they might organize wasteful and polluting business trips, what have you. This might mean a high level of energy consumption, and decreasing this implies taking measures of a cultural and fiscal nature. I'm not saying that everything is solved by this monetary reform. Okay? My point is simply being to explain how all of the things being equal, and in particular, all banks being so-called green and no new money being injected into the economy, which granted is a sort of extreme set of assumptions, but just to isolate the mechanisms here, energy consumption might be reduced through different banking practices and through different money creation procedures. Okay?
You have 3 minutes, Christian.
3 minutes? I've not claimed that these practices and procedures can solve all or even most issues linked to energy consumption. In fact, the problems linked to how households and businesses spend the existing money stock are quite substantial. After all, if we have a wise social and sustainable banking sector, even if we have a wise sustainable banking sector that does its very best to finance energy efficiency oriented investments, and even if we have made money creation public so that the amount of national currency in circulation can be controlled collectively rather than being left to private banks, we still have the question of how people spend the national currency. How can we be sure they won't spend it in ways that are hugely increasing total energy consumption? The answer is we can't. Especially in a globalized economy where goods can be imported, we need additional monetary incentives. Incentives of a different kind from the existing ones built into either bank debt money or plain money, if we want to avoid that the efforts of social and sustainable banks be thwarted and rendered ineffective by ecologically reckless consumers and businesses. And this is where complementary currency, the third component announced in my title, comes in. I'll try to be synthetic here. A popular idea nowadays, which has been around for quite a while, is to put into circulation permits to emit greenhouse gases and to allow these permits to be traded on so-called carbon markets. Okay? The idea, let me just remind the general public, is that by making CO2 emissions gradually more expensive per unit produced, we are going to impel the whole economy to seek out ways of producing in a more energy efficient manner. Okay? In fact, it's precisely that constraint that would strengthen the demand side of the sustainability-oriented credit market, right? That people are going to ask for, different projects to be financed if they are under this constraint, right? And that would channel more and more businesses toward sustainability-oriented banks. Now, of course, we should calculate emissions correctly, and that means adopting certainly a sort of cradle-to-cradle view where we look at a business's whole manufacturing chain from the use of raw materials upstream to the actual production processes and all the way downstream to how wastes are disposed of. Also, the total volume of permits has to evolve according, I think, to some sort of contract and converge logic by which global emissions are gradually reduced. That is, there are fewer additional tons of CO2 spewed into the atmosphere each year, and emission rights are gradually realigned across nations so as to ensure equal opportunity for development. That is, the North will have to emit less and less CO2 as the South emits more and more within the contracting global emissions budget. Okay? Next to these emission permits, and I take this idea from Richard Douthwaite, an international agency could issue a fixed stock of some ad hoc currency, which he calls energy-backed currency unit, EBQ. And this currency would be the only one that could legally be used to purchase additional permits, and would have to be acquired by states, by businesses that wanted to emit more than their initial national quota. Okay? And since the stock of EPQs would be fixed once and for all, we would de facto find ourselves in a sort of commodity money anchoring similar to the gold standard, except that here it would be a non-renewable energy standard, that is a sort of a currency backed by a stock of goods, energy goods, and in particular fossil fuels, whose available quantity would inexorably decrease over time. So if each citizen received an additional quota of permits, he or she could cash them in at their bank against standard currency, but at an exchange rate that would be determined by the exchange rate between permits and EPQs, hence between EPQs and standard currency. Okay? As to the bank, and that could be a business of the sustainability-oriented banks as well, it would subsequently, for a fee, resell the collected permits against standard currency to states or businesses that need them, up to the point where above quota permits need. Yes, let me just, I'm almost finished. I just want to unroll that argument, if it's okay with you. Need to be purchased by these states or businesses no longer in standard currencies, but in EPQs, okay, at the going exchange rate. And this would then lead to a cancellation of the corresponding number of EPQs, of energy-backed currency units, which are not replaced in that Wade's scenario, contrary to what is usually the case for bank money, which is precisely being replaced all the time because banks are for-profit firms. Okay? Therefore, each nation's quota decreases. The purchasing price of supernumerary permits gradually becomes prohibitive because there's almost no EPQ left in circulation. And as a result, businesses have to adapt to a drastically reduced emission bonus. Okay? Either they doggedly pursue the continued strategy of increasing energy efficiency through more and more expensive R&D, and they go to our social and sustainable banks for specific credit, or these businesses finally end up not only consuming less energy per unit produced, but simply producing fewer units, which is likely given the inherent limits to energy decoupling. And that, to me, is the essence of the mechanism towards a so-called post-growth economy. And that post-growth economy, let me finish with this, will only be socially viable if it offers work to all citizens. That is, if we, as Tim Jackson, I think, has forcibly argued, if we abandon the perpetual quest for increasing and even accelerating labor productivity. Okay? And that means we should actually add other types of currency, which I have no time now to develop. And it implies a sort of also wholesale return to what John Michael Greer has called ecotechnic technologies, which are more labor-intensive and more technically unsophisticated, hence less heteronomous in the sense of village. Okay? Now, this is hardly the place to set out an exhaustive or even reasonably detailed monetary and financial architecture for a sustainable economy. In Money and Sustainability, Dietar, Gerner, Brunhuber, and myself describe a number of other complementary currency mechanisms. Margaret has described a few. I think we'll hear about a few others during this conference that could and already sometimes do contribute to overall sustainability. The main message of my address is simply this: political decision makers, if there are some here, I heard there would be, but I don't see them, as well as economists and managers, especially in the financial and banking sectors, I think can no longer afford to treat sustainable banking, public money creation, and complementary currencies, in particular energy currencies, as marginal phenomena. Unless we skillfully combine these elements, we're going to have to continue to rely exclusively on a structurally flawed money system, and we're going to fail in building a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we now have a very, very short 5-minute break, because exactly in 5 minutes we have video link with Florida, where Hazel Henderson is waiting to be included into our conference. So please just take one cup of coffee and be immediately back. Because who knows, how much change is. Okay, thank you.